Hello, right, last one for tonight. Adenauer and West German foreign policy. So, essential to remember, of course, at all times that the West German foreign policy under Adenauer is conducted absolutely within the context of the developing Cold War. 1949, the USSR develops its first atomic weapon. So, what this means is that if any direct conflict, as opposed to some sort of proxy war or just increased tension, breaks out between the two superpowers and their associated allies, what we're looking at is mutually assured destruction, potentially nuclear holocaust. Threat of that not to be underestimated, and the impact of that on people's thinking. Equally, 1950, the Korean War breaks out. And so that really does further feed this sense, certainly in American policymakers' minds, that the global threat of communism is just that. It is global. It's spreading. And so, to a certain extent, actually, arguably, West Germany benefits from this, because whereas we see after World War One, kind of years in the wilderness, comparatively speaking, West Germany is more quickly reintegrated into the family of nations, in large part because they're being rapidly replaced in the minds, the psyches of the Western powers, policymakers' minds, their psyches, by the USSR as public enemy number one. So the other thing to bear in mind is that actually, until 1955, with the ending of the occupation statute, West Germany is not officially a sovereign state. The occupation statute specifies that West Germany cannot have its own foreign office or indeed its own foreign policy. So Adenauer has to effectively assume that role into the role of Chancellor, something he does all too comfortably. Think back to Chancellor democracy. And effectively does so. His principal tactic really is to join international organisations, to build alliances, both in Europe and globally. So, how does that take place? First step, 1949, the Petersburg Agreement. Not St. Petersburg in Russia, Petersburg in Germany, which ends the Western powers' dismantling of West German industry and their desire for a kind of reparations and so forth, and allows West Germany to formally establish diplomatic relations, so kind of a step towards some degree of sovereignty. The major area, excuse me, again, not a dry cough. In 1951, France, West Germany, Italy and the Benelux countries formed something called the European Coal and Steel Community, which is the very beginning of what later forms into today's European Union. It's initially officially a trade agreement. By pooling the means of production for coal and steel and opening up their markets, getting rid of all tariffs, it's hoped that they can gain efficiencies, and indeed they do. I think production increases 44% between 52 and 57, which is obviously remarkable, but actually it's never just an economic agreement. Coal and steel, of course, underpin heavy industry at this time. They're also absolutely vital for war. And if, as a series of countries, 6 countries at the heart of Europe, you're saying we're pooling our production of coal and steel, you're effectively saying we're going to make it impossible for us to easily go to war together again. So there's always a political trapping to it, always a kind of a peacemaking trapping to it. And in 1957, you actually get the Treaty of Rome, which builds upon the European Coal and Steel Community and starts the European Economic Community, which goes through various guises into today's EU. And that's West Germany is very much at the heart of that. Adenauer is really, really instrumental in setting that up. He is really keen to tie West Germany into a Western European community of nations, both economically but also politically, strategically, for defence purposes, potentially one day. That's discussed. And in so doing, partly restore the reputation of the German state. Other organisations are joined at various points as well. GATT, IMF, really critically in 1955, NATO. That's the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, kind of the club for people on America's side, if you like. And that's met with a few raised eyebrows in some quarters of West Germany, because it really is basically saying we are in this camp, and by so doing making any kind of immediate reunification far, far, far less likely. But it's also a big kind of rubber stamp from the Western allies to say, we no longer consider you our enemy. You are officially one of our allies. And indeed, in 1955, the occupation statute is ended. From 1955, also, West Germany is allowed to have an army. But again, that divides public opinion within Germany because people think that actually that's going to really, really anger the USSR and put any chance of reunification absolutely past the back burner and into some kind of non-existent hinterland. So, the USSR. Adenauer is a committed opponent of communism, and particularly East Germany, the existence of East Germany, not obviously the East German people, those were his kind of former compatriots, but his initial policy is one of magnet theory, of making the economy and the social conditions in the West so much more attractive than the East, that people would just effectively leave East Germany and come West, which prior to the wall being built, precisely, well, more than 3 million do. So it kind of works to begin with. He refuses to acknowledge the East German state, simply referring to it as the Soviet occupation zone, and refuses to have relations with it, because to acknowledge it would be to accept its existence and to accept the division of Germany. Now, in 1952, Stalin, there's some controversy about exactly what happened here, but Stalin issues a series of notes to the Western Allies, offering, with debatable degrees of sincerity, plans for reunification of Germany. However, the conditions were that Germany should be neutral, not in NATO, not in the Warsaw Pact, neutral. And Adenauer is extremely uneasy about this because he thinks, you say neutral, I hear defenceless, and is really, really pleased when the Western Allies, with his support, decline this offer. That, as you might expect, is met with mixed responses in some circles within West Germany, because it's thought, he had a chance at reunification, he didn't take it. But for Adenauer, security is more important than reunification, and that's a decision that he takes. He's not without successes on the Ostpolitik, the Eastern politics question. In 1955, he actually visits Moscow and negotiates with Stalin the release of the 10,000 German prisoners of war who are still in the USSR as kind of collateral reparations, and indeed 20,000 civilians who've been held there as kind of technical experts and various things like that. But thereafter, point blank refuses to acknowledge East Germany, or indeed anything to do with the Soviet bloc, and in fact formally pursues a policy called the Halstein doctrine, by which any country that formally recognises the sovereignty, the legitimacy of the East German state, is barred from receiving either trade agreements with West Germany, which is the third biggest trading power in the world, really significant player, or indeed, if they're a developing nation, making any applications for aid, any aid, which again from such a rich nation is not insignificant. This is quite an effective means of isolating East Germany and presenting West Germany as the legitimate German state. The criticisms that are later made of Adenauer's foreign policy would be that when events such as the East German uprising occur in 1953, or indeed the erection of the Berlin Wall, he takes not acknowledging East Germany a step too far, forgets that these are German brothers and sisters and that perhaps some intervention is warranted. The response to that could equally be that in the context of the Cold War and MAD, Adenauer's ability to intervene effectively is extremely limited, and he risks, with too strong a response, provoking a retaliation that's not commensurate with what's happened. And overall, in terms of rehabilitating West Germany as a respected member of the family of nations, and indeed securing trade agreements that further the economic miracle of West Germany, one would probably judge Adenauer's foreign policy to be a success.